Chapter 22 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Uncle Ramsay was large and imposing, with an effulgent complexion and a prosperous presence. He wore a double-jeweled ring on his apoplectic finger and a scarab scarf pin. His eyes were keen and shifty. His teeth had acquired the habit of clutching his fat black cigar viciously while he snarled his rather loose lips about them in conversation. Uncle Ramsay never looked one in the face when he was talking. He looked off into space, where he appeared to have the topic under discussion in visible form before him. He never took up with the conversation his host offered. He furnished the topics himself and pinned one down to them. It really was of no use whatever to start any subject unless it had been previously announced, because it never got further than the initiative. Uncle Ramsay always went on with whatever he had in mind. Tennelly knew this tendency, realized that in writing the letter he had taken the only possible way of bringing Courtland to his uncle's notice. After an exceedingly good dinner at the frat house, where Tennelly did not usually dine, and being further reinforced by one of the aforesaid fat black cigars, Uncle Ramsay leaned back in Tennelly's leather chair and began. "Now, Thomas." Tennelly stirred uneasily. He despised that Thomas. His full name was Llewellyn Thomas Tennelly. At home they called him Lou. Nobody but Uncle Ramsay ever dared the hateful Thomas. He liked to air the fact that his nephew was named after himself, the great Ramsay Thomas. "S'pose you tell me about this man you have for me. What kind of a looking man is he?" Uncle Ramsay screwed up his eyes, looked to the middle distance where the subject ought to be, and examined him critically. "Has he personality? Personality is a great factor in success, you know." Tennelly, in the brief space allowed him, declared that his friend would pass this test. "Well, and can he lead men? Because that is a very important point. The man I want must be a leader." "I think he is." And does he—" On down through a long list of questions. At last, after once more relighting his cigar, which had gone out frequently during the conversation, he turned to his nephew and fixed him sharply with a fat, pale blue eye. "Tell me the worst you know about him, Thomas. What are his faults?" he snapped, and settled back to squint at his imaginary stage again. Why, I don't think he has any," declared Tennelly, shifting uneasily in his chair. He had a feeling that Uncle Ramsay would get it out of him yet, and he did. "Yes, I perceive that he has. Out with it!" snapped the keen old bird, flinging his loose lips about restively. "It's only that he's got a religious twist lately, Uncle. I don't think it'll last. I really think he is getting over it." "Religion? Well, now that might not be so bad. Not for my purpose, you know. Religion really gives a confidence sometimes. Religion. Not a bad trait. Let me see him, Thomas. Let me see him at once." Tennelly had said nothing to Courtland about the approaching uncle, and therefore it was wholly a surprise to Courtland when Tennelly knocked on his door and dragged him from his books to meet a Chicago uncle. "He's come East looking for the right man to fill a very important position. It is something along your line, I guess. So I spoke to him about you," whispered Tennelly hastily as they crossed the hall together. Face to face they stood, the fancier and the young senior, and studied each other keenly for the fraction of a second. Courtland no less cool and impressive in his way than the older man, for Courtland was not afraid of any man, and his natural attitude toward all men was challenge till he knew them. He stood straight and tall and looked Uncle Ramsay in the eye critically, questioningly, courteously, but with no attempt to propitiate, and not the slightest apparent conception of the awesomeness of the occasion or the condescension of the august personage whom he was thus permitted to meet. And Uncle Ramsay liked it. True, he tried to fix the young man much as a cook fixes a roast with a skewer to be put over the fire, but Courtland didn't skew. He just sat down indifferently and looked the man over, smiled pleasantly now and then, and listened. But he didn't give an inch, even when the marvelous proposition was made to him which might change the whole course of his future life and cover his name with glory. Courtland never flickered an eyelash. He took it as calmly as if I'd been offering him toast with his tea when he'd already had bread and jam. The young whelp! Marveled Uncle Ramsay delightedly after Courtland had thanked him, promised to think it over, and gone back to his room. He's got the personality all right. He'll do. But what's his idea in being so reluctant? Didn't the offer strike him as big enough, or what's the matter? I must say I don't like to wait. When I find a man I like to nail him. What's the idea, Thomas? Has he got something else up his sleeve? Not that I know of, said Tennelly, looking troubled. I guess he's just got to think it over. That's Court. He never steps into a position until he knows exactly what he thinks about it. Another good trait. You sure it isn't anything else? I don't know of anything, unless some of his religious notions are standing in his way. I'm sure I can't quite make him out lately. He had a shock a few months ago, one of the fellows killed in a fire, and he can't seem to get over it quite. Oh, well, we'll fix him up all right, said Uncle Ramsay contentedly. We'll just send him down to our model factory here in the city and let him see how things are run. Convince him he's doing good, and that'll settle him. All white marble with vines over the place, and a big rest room and reading room for the hands, gymnasium on the roof, model restaurant all up to date. Cost a lot of money, too, but it pays. When some whining idiot of a woman that hasn't enough business of her own to attend to goes blabbing down there at Washington about the conditions in the factories and all that rot, we just run a few senators up here for the day and show 'em that model factory. Oh, it pays in the long run. You take your man there and you'll land him all right. By the way, there's a little rat of a preacher down around that factory that I'd like to throttle. He's making us all sorts of trouble, stirring up the folks to ask for all sorts of things. He's putting it in their heads to demand an 8-hour day, and no telling how much more. He's undertaken to tell us how we ought to run our business. Tell us which doors we shall lock and which leave unlocked, how often we shall let our hands sit down, and what kind of machines we shall get. He's a regular little rat. Know him? His name's Burns. Insignificant little puppy. And he's got a pull down there in Washington, somehow, that's making us a lot of trouble, too. That's one thing I want this new man for. I want to train him to spy on that sort of interference and by do some lobbying. We must stop such business as that. What time is it? I guess perhaps I better run down and hunt out that little rat and give him a good scare. Uncle Ramsay departed rat hunting, and Tennelly repaired to Courtland's room. He sat down and began to tell what a wonderful opportunity this was, and how unprecedented in Uncle Ramsay to have offered such a thing to a young man still in college. It showed how wonderfully he had been taken with Courtland. It was most flattering. Courtland admitted that it was, and that he was grateful to his friend for mentioning his name. He said it looked like a very good thing, like the kind of thing he had been hoping would turn up when he got through college, but he couldn't decide it immediately. Tennelly urged that Uncle Ramsay was insistent, that his business was urgent, and he must know one way or the other immediately. He tried to give Courtland an adequate idea of the greatness of Uncle Ramsay and the audacity of anybody, especially a little college upstart, attempting to keep him waiting. But Courtland only shook his head and said it wouldn't be possible for him to give his answer at once. If that was the condition of the offer, he would have to let it pass. Tennelly talked and talked, but finally went back to his room baffled. He just couldn't understand what was the matter with Courtland. When Uncle Ramsay returned from a fruitless search for the rat, he was enraged to find that Courtland was not awaiting his coming in trembling eagerness to accept his munificent offer. Another personal interview that evening brought nothing more satisfactory than a promise to look into the matter carefully and to have another talk the next evening. Uncle Ramsay raged and swore. He blamed the little rat of a preacher and declared he must leave for Boston that evening. But he finally sent a telegram instead and decided to remain until the next night. There were matters in the city he was intending to look after on his return, and of course he could do it now instead. He felt it was important that that young man should be landed before he had a chance to do too much thinking. Moreover, he was piqued that a youngster like that should presume to consider turning down a job like the one he was offering him. If Courtland had tried to explain to Tennelly and his uncle just why this offer, which would have delighted him so much 3 months before, was hanging in the balance of his mind, they would scarcely have understood. He would have to tell them of the presence which was by his side, which had been very real to him as he stood in Tennelly's room listening to Uncle Ramsay that afternoon, and which had hovered by him since, so close, so strong, with that pervading, commanding nearness that demanded his utmost attention. He would have to tell them that he was under orders now, being led, and that every step was new and untried. He must look into the face of his companion and guide and find out if this was the way he was to go. Something somewhere was holding him back. He did not know why. He did not see for how long. He simply could not make that decision to night. He must await permission before moving. Possibly the trip to the factory the next day, which he had promised to take, might give him some light in the matter. Possibly he would find counsel somewhere. But where? He thought of Gila. He took out a lovely photograph of her that she had given him before he left her Sunday night, a charming, airy, idealistic thing of earth and fire that had lain innocently open upon the library table where some one had left it earlier in the day. He stood it up on his desk and studied the spirited, will-o'-the-wisp face. Then he turned away sadly and shook his head. She would not understand. Not yet. Sometime, when he had told her about the Presence, but not yet. She could not understand because she had not seen for herself. Tennelly and his uncle went downtown in the morning and took lunch together. Courtland was to meet them at the factory at 3 o'clock, but somehow he missed them. Perhaps it was intention. Courtland went early. He wanted to see things for himself. Went alone first. Afterward he could go the rounds to satisfy Mr. Thompson, but first he would see it alone. Then, after all, it was the Reverend Robert Burns who met him at the door and took him through the factory, bent on seeing some parishioner on an errand of love. And there was that strange sense of the Presence having been there before them, walking about among the machinery, looking at the tired face of one, sorrowing over the wrinkles in another forehead, pitying the weary hands that toiled, blessing the faithful. It reminded him of the morgue in that. For a minute he began to think that if the Presence was here in this peculiar sense, then of course it was an indication that he was needed here to work for these people, as Uncle Ramsay had tried with strange worldly wisdom to make him understand. But then, suddenly, he caught a glimpse of the face of the little minister, white under its freckles, with a righteous wrath as he fixed his gaze sternly on the door at the end of the long room. He looked up quickly to hear the click of a key in a lock as the foreman passed from one room to another. He glanced down at the minister and their eyes met. They locked them in here like sheep in a pen. If a fire should break out they would all die, said the minister under his breath. His lips were trembling with the helplessness of himself against the power of a great trust. You don't say, said Courtland, startled. It was his first view of conditions of this sort. He looked about with eyes alive to things he had not seen before. But I thought this was a model factory. Isn't it absolutely fireproof? Somewhat so, on the outside, shrugged Burns. It's a whited sepulcher. That's what it is. Beautiful marble and vines, beautiful rest room and library for the visitors to rest and read in. Beautiful restaurant where the girls must buy their meals at the company's prices or go without. Beautiful outside everywhere, but it's rotten, absolutely rotten all through. Look at the width of that staircase. That's the one the employees use. The visitors only see the broad way by which you came up. Look at those machines, all painted and gilded. They are old models and twice as heavy to work as the new ones, but we can't get them to make changes. Look at those seats, put there to impress the visitors. The fact is, not one of the hands dare use them, except a minute now and then when the foreman happens to leave the room. They know they will get docked in their pay if they are caught sitting down at their work. And yet it is always flaunted before the visitors that the workmen can sit down when they like. So they can, but they can go home without a pay envelope if they do, when Saturday night comes. Oh, there is enough here to make one's blood boil. You're interested in these things? I wish you'd let me tell you more sometime about the long hours, the stifling air in some rooms, and the little children working in spite of the law. I wish men like you would come down here and help clean this section out and make conditions different. Why don't you come and help me?" The minister laid his hand on Courtland's arm, and instantly it seemed as if the Presence came and stood beside him and said, "Here, this is your work." With a great conviction in his heart, Courtland turned and followed Burns down the broad marble stairs out to the office, where he left word for Tennelly and his uncle that he had been there and had to go, but would see them again that evening, and then down the street to Burns's common little boarding house, where they sat down and talked the rest of the afternoon. Burns opened Courtland's eyes to many things that he had not known were in the world. It was as if he laid his hands upon him and said as of old, "Brother Saul, receive thy sight." When Courtland went back to the university his decision was made. He felt that he was under orders, and the Presence would not go with him in any such commission as Uncle Ramsay had proposed. His only regret was that Tennelly would not understand. Dear old Tennelly, who had tried to do his best for him. The denouement began in Tennelly's room after supper, when Courtland courteously and firmly thanked Uncle Ramsay, but declined the offer. Uncle Ramsay grew apoplectic in the face and glared at the young man, finally bringing out an explosive, "What? You decline?" Uncle Ramsay sputtered and swore. He tore up and down the small confines of the room like an angry bull, bellowing forth anathemas and arguments in a confused jumble. He enlarged on the insult he had been given and the opportunity that was being lost never to be offered again. He called Courtland a trifling idiot and a few other gentle phrases, and demanded reasons for such an unprecedented decision. Courtland's only answer was, "I am afraid it isn't going to fit in with my views of life, Mr. Thomas. I have thought it over carefully, and I cannot accept your offer." "Why not? Isn't it enough money?" roared the mad financier. "I'll double your salary." "Money has nothing to do with it," said Courtland, quietly. That would make no difference. He was sorry for this scene for Tennelly's sake. "Well, have you something else in view?" "No, not definitely." "Then you're a fool," said Uncle Ramsay, and further stated what kind of a fool he was several times, vigorously, after which he mopped his beaded brow with trembling, agitated hands and sat down. The old bull was baffled at last. Uncle Ramsay blustered all the way to the train with his nephew. "I've got to have that young man, Thomas. There's no two ways about it. A fellow that can stand out the way he did against Ramsay Thomas is just the man I want. He's got personality. Why, a man like that at work for us would be worth millions. He would give confidence to everyone. Why, we could make him a senator in a few years, and there's no telling where he wouldn't stop. He's the kind of man who could be put in the White House if things shaped themselves right. I've got to have him, Thomas, and no mistake. Now, I'm going to put it up to you to find out the secret of this thing. You just get his number, and we'll meet him on any reasonable proposition he wants to put up. Say, Thomas, isn't there a girl anywhere that could influence him?" "Yes, there's a girl." "The very thing! You put her wise about it, and when I come back next week I'll stop off again and see what I can do with her. You can take me to call on her, you know. Can you work it, Thomas?" Tennelly said he'd try, and went around to see Gila on his way back to the university. Gila listened to the story of Uncle Ramsay's offer with bated breath and averted gaze. She would not show Tennelly how much this meant to her, but in her eyes there grew a determination that was not to be denied. She planned a campaign with Tennelly, coolly, and with a light kind of glee that fooled him completely. He saw that she was entering into the spirit of the thing and had no idea she had any other interest than to please her cousin and achieve a kind of triumph herself in making Courtland do the thing he had vowed not to do. But long after Tennelly had gone home she stood before her mirror, looking with dreamy eyes into the pictures her imagination drew there for her. She saw herself the bride of Courtland after he had succeeded in the big business enterprise to which Uncle Ramsay had opened the door. She saw Washington with its domes and Capitol looming ahead of her ambition, senators and great men bowing before her. Even the White House came like a fantasy of possibility. All this and more were hers if she played her cards aright. Never fear. She would play them. Courtland must be made to accept Uncle Ramsay's proposition. End of chapter 22. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. Chapter 23 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bonnie's letter reached Mother Marshall Wednesday afternoon while Father was off in the machine arranging for a man to do the spring plowing. She knew it by heart before he got back, and stood at her trysting window with her cheek against the old hat, watching the sunset and thinking it over when the car came chugging contentedly down the road. Father waved his hand boyishly as he turned in at the big gate, and Mother was out on the side doorstep waiting as he came to a halt. "Heard anything yet?" he asked eagerly. "Yes, a nice dear letter." Mother held it up. "Hurry up and come in and I'll read it to you." But Father couldn't wait to put away the machine. He bounded out like a 4-year-old and came right in then, regardless of the fact that it was getting dark and he might run into the door jamb putting away the machine later. He settled down, overcoat and all, into the big chair in the kitchen to listen, and Mother put on her spectacles in such a hurry that she got them upside down and had to begin over again. "You dear Mother Marshall," the letter began, "and dear Father Marshall, too. I think it is just the most wonderful thing that I ever heard of that you are willing to invite a stranger like me to visit you. At first I thought it wasn't right to accept such great kindness from people I never saw, and who didn't know whether they could even like me or not. But afterward Mr. Courtland told me about your Stephen and that you had suffered too, and then I knew that I might take you at your word and come for a little while to get the comfort I need so much. Even then I couldn't have done it if Mr. Courtland and my nurse hadn't told me they were sure I could get something to do and so be able to repay you for all this kindness. If I can really be of any comfort to you in your loneliness, I shall be so glad. But I'm afraid I could never even half fill the place of so fine a son as you must have had. Mr. Courtland has told me how grandly he died. He saw him, you know, at the very last minute, and saw all he did to save others. But if you will let me love you both, I shall be so grateful. All that I had on earth are gone home to God now, and the world looks so long and hard and sad to me. I do hope you can love me a little while I stay, and that you will not let me make you any trouble. Please don't go to any work to get ready for me. I will gladly do anything that is necessary when I get there. I am quite able to work now, and if I have a place where I can feel that somebody cares whether I live or die, it will not be so hard to face the future. A great strange city is an awful place for a girl that has a heavy heart. I am so glad that you know Jesus Christ. It makes me feel at home before I get there. My dear father was a minister. They wouldn't let me go and pack up, so I had to do the best I could with directing the kind friends who did it for me. I have taken you at your word and had Mother's sewing machine and a box of my little brother's things sent with my trunk. But if they are in the way, I can sell them or give them away. And I don't want you to feel that I am going to presume upon your kindness and settle down on you indefinitely. Just as soon as I get a chance to work, I must take it. And I shall want to repay you, for all you have done for me. You have sent me a great deal more money than I need. I start Wednesday evening on the through express. I have marked a timetable and am sending it because we are unable to find out just what time I can make connections from Grant's Junction, where they say I have to change. Perhaps you will know. But don't worry about me. I'll find my way to you as soon as I can get there. I am praying all the time that I shall not disappoint you. And now, till I see you, sincerely and gratefully, Rose Bonner Brentwood. It couldn't be improved on, declared Mother beamingly. It's just what I'd have wanted her to say if I'd been planning it all out, only more so. It's all right, said Father excitedly, but that's one thing we forgot. We ought to have sent her word we would meet her at the station, and what time the train left Grant's Junction and all. Now that's too bad. Now don't you worry, Father. She'll find her way. Like as not the conductor will have a timetable and be able to tell her all about the trains. But I certainly do wish we had let her know we would meet her. They were still worrying about it that night at 9 o'clock, while Father wound the kitchen clock and Mother put a mackerel a soak for breakfast. Suddenly the telephone in the next room gave a whir, and both Father and Mother jumped as if they had been shot, looking at each other in bewildered question as they hastened to the phone. It was Father who took the receiver. A telegram? For Mr. Seth Marshall? Yes, I'm listening. Write it down, Mother. A telegram. Mercy! Perhaps she wasn't well enough to start, gasped Mother, putting her pencil in place. Miss Brentwood left tonight at 9:15 on express number 10. Car Alicia, lower berth number 8. Please let me know if she arrives safely. Paul Courtland. Now, isn't that thoughtful of him? He said as he hung up the receiver. He must have sensed we wanted to send her word, and now we can do it. Send her word? Said Mother, bewildered. Why, surely. Haven't you read in the papers how they send messages to trains that are moving? It's great, isn't it, Mother? To think this little dinky telephone puts you and me out here on this farm in touch with all the world. Do you mean you can send a telegram to her on board the train, Seth? Asked Mother in astonishment. Sure, said Father. We've got all the numbers of everything. Just send to that express train that left tonight. What was it? Express number 10 and so on, and it'll be sent along and get to her. Well, I think I'd ask her to answer then, to make sure she got it. I think that's a mighty uncertain way to send messages to people flying along on an express train. If you don't get any word from her, you'll never know whether she got it or not. And then you won't know whether to meet her at Sloan's or Maitland, said Mother with a worried pucker on her forehead. Sure, said Father, taking down the receiver. I can do that. It's just wonderful, Seth, how much you know about little important things like that, sighed Mother when the telegram was sent. Now I think we better go right to bed, for I've got to get to baking early in the morning. I want to have bread and pies and doughnuts fresh when she comes. It was while they were eating breakfast that the answer came. Telegram received. Will come to Sloan's station. Having comfortable journey. R.B.B. Now, isn't that just wonderful? Said Mother, sitting back weakly behind the coffee pot and wiping away an excited tear with the corner of her apron. To think that can be done. Now, wouldn't it be just beautiful if we had telephones to heaven? Think if we could get word from Stephen today, how happy we'd be. Why, we have, said Father. Wait. And he reached over to the little stand by the window and grasped the worn old Bible. Here, listen to this. For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which are asleep. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God. And the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds, to meet the Lord in the air. And so shall we ever be with the Lord. Wherefore, comfort one another with these words. There, Mother. Ain't that just as good as any telegram from a moving train? And it's signed with his own seal and signature. It means he's heard our sorrow about Stephen's leaving us, and he heard it ages before we felt it ourselves, and wrote this down for us. Sent us a telegram this morning just to comfort us. I reckon that meeting with Stephen and the Lord in the air is going to knock the spots clean out of this little old meeting to morrow morning down at Sloan Station. We won't need our automobile any more after that. We'll have wings, Mother. How you like to fly?" Mother gave a little gasp of joy and smiled at Father like a rainbow through her tears. "That's so, Father. We don't need telephones to heaven, do we? I guess his words cover all our needs if we'd only remember to look for them. Now, Father, I must get at those doughnuts. Was you going to take the machine and run down to town and see if those books have come yet? They surely ought to be here by this time. Then don't forget to fix that fire up in the bedroom so it'll be all ready to light when she gets here. Isn't it funny, Father? We don't know how she looks, not in the least. And if two girls should get off the train at Sloan Station, we wouldn't know which was the right one." "Well, I should," declared Father. "I'm dead certain there ain't two girls in the whole universe could have written that letter. And if you'd put any other one down with her, and I saw them side by side, I could tell first off which she was." So they helped each other through that last exciting day, finding something to do up to the very last minute, the next morning before it was time to start to Sloan Station to meet the train. Mother would go along, of course. She pictured herself standing for hours beside that kitchen window with her cheek against the old hat, waiting and wondering what had happened that they hadn't come, and she couldn't see it that way. So she left the dinner in such stages of getting ready that it could be soon brought to completion, and wrapped herself in her big gray cloak. Father went faster than he had ever been known to go since he got the car, and Mother never even noticed. He got a panic lest his watch might be out of the way and the train arrive before they got there. So they arrived at the station almost an hour ahead of the train. "Oh, I'm so glad it's a pretty day," said Mother Marshall, slipping her gloved hands in her sleeves to keep from shivering with excitement. Mother Marshall sat quite decorously in the automobile till the train drew up to the platform and people began to get out. But when Bonnie stepped down from the car she forgot all about her doubts as to how they would know her, and jumped right out on the platform without waiting to be helped. She rushed up to Bonnie, saying, "This is our Bonnie, isn't it?" and folded her arms about the girl, forgetting entirely that she hadn't meant to use the name until the girl gave her permission, that she had no right to know the name even, wasn't supposed to have heard of it, and was sort of giving the young man away, as it were. But it didn't matter. Bonnie was so glad to hear her own name called in that endearing tone that she just put her face down in Mother Marshall's comfortable neck and cried. She couldn't help it. Right there while the train was still at the station and the other travelers were peering curiously out of the sleeper at the beautiful pale girl in black who was being met by that nice old couple with the automobile. Somehow it made them all feel glad. She had looked so sad and alone all the journey. What a ride that was home again to the farm, with Mother Marshall cuddling and crooning to her, "Oh, my dear pretty child, to think you've really come all this long way to comfort us!" and Father running the old machine at an unheard of rate of speed, slamming along over the road as if he had been sent for in great haste, and reaching his big fur glove back now and then to pat the old buffalo robe that was tucked snugly over Bonnie's lap. Bonnie herself was fairly overcome and couldn't get her equilibrium at all. She had thought these must be wonderful people to be inviting a stranger and doing all they were doing, but such a reception as this she had never dreamed of. "Oh, you are so good to me!" sobbed Bonnie, with a smile through her tears. "I know I'm acting like a baby, but I can't seem to help it. I've had nobody so long, and now to be treated like this, I just can't stand it. It seems as if I'd got home." "Why, sure! That's what you have," said Father in his big, hearty voice. "Put your head right down on my shoulder and cry if you want to, my pretty," said Mother Marshall, pulling her softly over toward her. "You can't think how good it is to have you here. Father and I were so afraid you wouldn't come. We thought you mightn't be willing to come so far to utter strangers." So it went on all the way, all of them so happy they didn't quite know what they were saying. Then when they got to the house, even Father was so far gone that he couldn't let them go upstairs alone. He just had to leave the machine standing by the kitchen door and carry that little hand bag up as an excuse to see how she would like the room. Bonnie, pulling off her gloves, entered the room when Mother opened the door. She looked around bewildered a moment, as if she had stepped from the middle of winter into a summer orchard. Then she cried out with delight, "Oh, how perfectly beautiful! You didn't mean me to have this lovely room? It isn't right. A stranger and a pauper!" "Nothing of the kind," growled Father, patting her on the shoulder. "Just a daughter come home." Then he beat a hasty retreat to the fireplace and touched a match to the fire already laid, while Mother, purring like a contented old pussy, pushed the bewildered girl into the big flowered chair in front of the fire and began unfastening her coat and taking off her hat reverently, half in awe, for she was not used to girls' fixings, and they held almost as much mystery for her as if she had been a man. In the midst of it all, Mother remembered that dinner ought to be eaten at once, and that Bonnie must have a chance to wash her face and straighten her hair before dinner. So Father and Mother, with many a reluctant lingering and last word, as if they were not going to see her for a month, finally bustled off together. In just no time at all Bonnie was down there too, begging to be allowed to help, and declaring herself perfectly able, although her white face and the dark rings under her tired eyes belied her. Mother Marshall was not sure, after all, but she ought to have put Bonnie to bed and fed her with chicken broth and toast instead of letting her come downstairs to eat stewed chicken, little fat biscuits with gravy, and the most succulent apple pie in the world, with a creamy glass of milk to make it go down. Father had just finished trying to make Bonnie take a second helping of everything when he suddenly dropped the carving knife and fork with a clatter and sprang up from his chair. "I declare to goodness, Mother, if I didn't forget!" he said, and rushed over to the telephone. "Why, that's so!" cried Mother. "Don't forget to tell him how much we love her." Bonnie looked from one to the other of them in astonishment. "It's that young man," explained Mother. "He wanted we should telegraph if you got here all safe. You know he sent us a message after he put you on the train." "How very thoughtful of him!" said Bonnie, earnestly. "He is the most wonderful young man. I can't begin to tell you all he did for me, a mere stranger." "And so that explains how you knew where to send your message. I puzzled a good deal over that." 4 hours later, Courtland, coming up to his room after basket-ball practice, a hot shower, and a swim in the pool, found the telegram: "Traveler arrived safely. Bore the journey well. Many thanks for the introduction. Everybody happy. If you don't believe it, come and see for yourself. Father and Mother Marshall." Courtland read it and looked dreamily out of the window, trying to fancy Bonnie in her new home. Then he said aloud with conviction, "Sometime I shall go out there and see." Just then some one knocked at his door and handed in a note from Gila. "Dear Paul, come over this evening. I want to see you about something very special. Hastily, Gila." End of chapter 23. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. Chapter 24 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gila's note came to Courtland as a happy surprise. He had not expected to see her until the next evening. Not that he had brooded much over the matter. He was too busy and too sanely healthy to do that. Besides, he was only as yet questioning within himself whether he was going to fall in love. The sensation so far was exceedingly pleasurable, and he was ready for the whole thing when it should arrive and prove itself. But at present he was just in that quiescent stage when everything seemed significant and delightfully interesting. He had firmly resolved that the next time he saw Gila he would tell her of his own heart experience with regard to the Presence. He realized that he must go carefully and not shock her, for he had begun to see that all her prejudices would be against taking any stock in such an experience. He had only so shortly himself come from a like position that he could well understand her extreme views, her what amounted almost to repugnance toward hearing anything about it, but he would make her see the whole thing just as he had seen it. Now Gila had no notion of allowing any such recital as Courtland was planning. She had her stage all set for entirely another scene, and she had on her most charming mood. She was wearing a little frock of pale blue wool, so simple that a child of 10 might have worn it under a white ruffled apron. The neck was decorated with soft kerchief-like collar. Not even a pin marred the simplicity of her costume. Her hair, too, was simpler than usual, almost carrying out the childish idea with its soft looping away from the face. Little heelless black satin slippers were tied with narrow black ribbons quaintly crossed and recrossed over the slim blue silk ankles, carrying out the charming idea of a modest, simple maiden. Nothing could be more coy and charming than the way she swept her long black lashes down upon her pearly cheeks. Her great eyes, when they were lifted, were clear and limpid as a baby's. Courtland was fairly carried off his feet at sight of her, and felt his blood bound in reassurance. This must be love. He had fallen in love at last, he who had scorned the idea so long and laughed at the other fellows, until he had really begun to have doubts in his own heart whether the delightful illusion would ever come to him. The glamour was about Gila to-night, and no mistake. He looked at her with his heart in his eyes, and she drooped her lashes to hide a glint of triumph, knowing she had chosen her setting aright at last. Softly, dreamily, pleasantly, in the back of her mind floated the capital of the nation, and herself standing amid admiring throngs receiving homage. She was going to succeed. She had achieved her first triumph with a look in Courtland's eyes. She would be able to carry out Mr. Ramsay Thomas's commission and win Courtland to anything that would forward ambitious hopes for him. She was sure of it. The very important business about which she had wished to see Courtland was to ask him if he would be her partner in a bazaar and pageant that was shortly to be given for some charitable purpose by the society folks with whom she companioned. She wanted Courtland to march with her, and to consult him about the characters they should choose and the costumes they should wear. As if she had been a child desiring him to play with her, he yielded to her mood, watching her all the time with delighted eyes, that anything so exquisite and lovely should stoop to sue for his favor. Of course he would be her partner. He entered into the arrangements with a zest, though he let her do all the planning, and heeded little what character she had chosen for him, or what costume, so she was pleased. Indeed, his part in the matter seemed of little moment, so he might go with her, his sweet, shy, lovely maiden, for so she seemed to him that night, a perfect Solveig. The only reason for the little slippers became apparent later, when she insisted upon teaching him the dancing steps that were to be used in a final splendid assembly after the pageant. There was intoxication in the delight of moving with her through the dreamy steps to the music of the expensive Victrola she set going, just to watch her little feet like fairies for lightness and grace, to touch her small warm hand, to be so near those down-drooping lashes, to feel her breath on his hand, to think of her as trusting her lovely little self to him, made him almost deliriously happy. And she, with her drooping lashes, her delicate way of barely touching his arm, her utter seeming unconsciousness of his presence, was so exquisite and pure and lovely to-night. She did not dream, of course, of how she made his pulses thrill, and how he was longing to gather her into his arms and tell her how lovely she was. Afterward, he was never quite sure what kept him from doing it. He thought at the time it was herself, a sort of wall of purity and loveliness that surrounded her and made her sacred, so that he felt he must go slowly, must not startle her nor make her afraid of him. It never occurred to him that the wall might be surrounding himself. He had entirely forgotten that first visit to Gila in the Mephistophelian garments, with the red light filling all the unholy atmosphere. There had never been so much as a hint of a red light in the room since he said he did not like it. The lamp shade seemed to have disappeared. In its place was a great wrought metal thing of old silver jeweled with opalescent medallions. But it was part of the deliberate intention of Gila to lead him on, and yet hold him at a distance. She had read him aright. He was a man with an old-fashioned ideal of women, and the citadel of his heart was only to be taken by such a woman. Therefore she would be such a woman until she had won. After that, what mattered it? Let time plan the issue. She would have attained her desire. But the down-drooping lashes hid no unconscious sweetness. There was sinister gleam in those eyes as she looked at herself over his shoulder when they passed the great mirror set in a cabinet door. There was deliberate intention in the way the little hand lay lightly in the strong one. There was not a movement of the dreamy dance she was teaching him, not a touch of the little satin slipper that did not have its nicely calculated intention to draw him on. The sooner she could make him yield and crush her to him, the sooner he declared his passion for her, that much nearer would her ambitions be to their fulfillment. Yet she must be very sure that she had him close in her toils before she discovered to him her purpose. So the little blue Puritan-like spider threw her silver gossamer web about him, tangling more and more his big, fine, manly heart, and flinging diamond dust and powder made of charms and incantations in his eyes to blind him. But as yet she knew not of the presence that was now his constant companion. They had danced for some time, floating about in the pure delight of the motion together, and the nearness of each other, when it seemed to Courtland as if of a sudden a cooling hand was laid on his feverish brow, and a calm came to his spirit like a beloved voice calling his name with the accent that is sure of quick response. It was so he remembered what he had come to tell Gila. Looking down to that exquisite bit of humanity almost within his embrace, a great tenderness for her and longing came over him to make her know now all that the presence was becoming to him. "Gila," he whispered, and his voice was full of thrill. "Let's sit down a while. There is something I want to tell you." Instantly she responded, lifting great innocent eyes with one quick sweep to his face, so moved and tender, and gliding toward the couch where they might sit together, settling down on it, almost nestling to him, then remembering and drawing away shyly to more perfectly play her part. She thought she knew what he was going to say. She thought she saw the love light in his eyes, and it was so dazzling it almost blinded her. It frightened her a little, too, like the love in no lover's eyes that had ever drawn her down to whisper love to her before. She wondered if it was because she really cared herself so much now that it seemed so different. But he did not take her in his arms as she had expected him to do, though he sat quite near, and spoke in a low, privileged tone, as one would do who had the right. His arm was across the back of the couch behind her. He sat sideways, turned toward her, and he still touched reverently the little hand he had been holding as they danced together. "Gila, I have a story to tell you," he said. "Until you know it, you can never understand me fully, and I want with all my heart to have you understand me. It is something that has become a part of me." She sat quivering, wondering, half fearful. A gleam of jealousy came into her averted face. Was he going to tell her about another girl? A fierce, unreasoning anger shot across her face. She would not tolerate the thought that anyone had had him before. Was it? It couldn't be that baby-faced pauper in the hospital. She drew her slim little body up tensely and waited for the story. Courtland told the story of Stephen, told it well and briefly. He pictured Stephen so that the girl must needs admire. No woman could have heard that description of a man such as Stephen had been and not bow her woman's heart and wish that she might have known him. Gila listened fascinated, even up to the moment of the fire and the tragedy when Stephen fell into the flames. She shuddered visibly several times, but sat tense and still and listened. She even was unmoved when Courtland went on to tell of finding himself on a ledge above the burning mass, creeping somehow into a small haven, shut in by a wall of smoke, and feeling that this was the end. But when he began to tell of the presence, the light, the voice, the girl gave a sudden start and gripped her cold hands together. Almost imperceptibly she drew her tense little body away from him and turned slowly till she faced him, horror and consternation in her eyes, utter unbelief and scorn on her lips. But still she did not speak, still held her gaze on him and listened, while he told of coming back to life, the hospital walls, the strange emptiness, and the presence, the recovery, and the presence still with him, the going here and there and finding the presence always before him and yet with him. "He is here in this room with us, Gila," he said, simply, as if he had been telling her that he had brought her some flowers and he hoped she would like them. Then suddenly Gila gave a spring away from him to her feet, uttered a wild scream of terror, and burst into angry tears. Courtland sprang to his feet in dismay and instant contrition. He had made the horror of the fire too dramatic. He had not realized how dreadful it would be to a woman's delicate sensibilities. This gentle, loving girl had felt it all to her soul, and her nerves had given way before the reality of it. He had been an idiot to tell the story in that bald way. He should have gone about it more gently. He was not used to women. He must learn better. Would she forgive him? And now, indeed, he had her in his arms, although he was utterly unaware of it. He was trying to comfort and soothe her, as he would soothe a little child who had been frightened. Not only his handkerchief, but his hands were called into requisition to charm away those tears and comfort the pitiful little face that looked so streaked and pink and helpless there against his shoulder. He wanted to stoop and lay his lips on those trembling ones. Perhaps Gila thought he would, but he would not take advantage of her moment of helplessness. Not until she was herself and could give him permission would he avail himself of that sacred privilege. Now it was the part of a man to comfort her without any element of self in the matter. When he had drawn her down upon the couch again, with the sobs still shaking her soft blue and white frilly breast, her blue-black hair all damp and tossed upon her temples, and tried to tell her how sorry he was that he had put her through the horrors of that fire, she put in a quivering protest. It was not the fire, she shivered. It was not the horror and the smoke. It was not Stephen's death, nor the danger to himself. It was not any of those that had unnerved her. It was that awful other thing he had said, that ghostly, ghastly, uncanny, dreadful story of a presence. She almost shrieked again as she said it, and she shivered away from him, as if still there was something cold and clammy in his touch that gave her the horrors. A cold disappointment settled down upon him. She had not understood. He looked at her, troubled, disappointed, baffled. It was not possible, then, for him to bring her this knowledge that he wished so much for her to have. It was a thing that one could tell about to one's friends, but could not give them. It was something they must take for themselves, must feel and see by themselves. With new illumination he turned to her, and said in a voice wonderfully tender for a man so young: "Listen, Gila. I have been clumsy in telling you. You cannot see it just from my poor story, but he will come to you, and you shall see him for yourself. I will ask him to come to you as he has to me." Again that piercing scream, and with a quick, lithe movement, almost like a serpent, she slid from his side and stood quivering in the middle of the room, her eyes flashing, her body shrieking, both little hands clenched at her throat. "Stop!" she cried. "Stop!" and screamed again, stamping her foot. "I won't hear such horrible things. I won't have any spirits coming around me. I won't see them. Do you understand? I hate that presence, and I hate you when you talk like that." She had worked herself into a fine tantrum, but there was behind it all a horrible fear and shrinking from the Christ he had described, the shrinking of the naked soul in the garden from its God. The drooping, childlike eyes were wide with horror now. The sweet, innocent mouth was trembling with emotion. She was anything but Solveig like. If Courtland caught a glimpse of the real Gila through it all, he laid it to his own clumsy way of handling the delicate mystery of a girl's shy nature. He saw she was wrought up beyond her control, and he was so far under the illusion that he blamed himself only, and set himself to calm her. He coaxed her to sit down again, put his strong hand on her quivering one, marveling in tenderness at its smallness and softness. He talked to her in quiet, soothing tones, grave and reassuring. He promised he would talk no more about the presents till she was ready to hear. He was leaning toward her in his strength, his arm behind her, his hand on her shoulder with a sheltering, comforting touch, when he told her this, as one would treat a little child in trouble. And suddenly, like the sun flashing out from behind the clouds, she lifted up her teary face and smiled, nestling toward him, her head falling down on his shoulder with a sigh, like a tired, satisfied child, her face lifted temptingly, so close, so very close to his. It was then that he did the thing that bound him to what followed. He stooped and laid his lips upon her warm little trembling ones, and kissed her. The thrill that shot through him was like the click of shackles snapping shut about one's wrist, like the turning of the key in a prison house, the shooting of the bolt to one's dark cell. He held her there and touched her soft hair with his finger-tips, touched her cool little forehead with his lips, touched her warm, soft lips again, and felt the thrill. But something was the matter. He felt the surging forces within him rise and batter at the gate of his self-control. He wanted to say, "Gila, I love you," but the words stuck in his throat. What had he done? Whence came this sense of defeat and loss? The presence! Where was the presence? Yes, there, but withdrawn, standing apart in sadness, while he sat comforting and caressing one who had just said she hated him. But that was because she had not seen him yet. She was frightened because she did not understand. He would yet be able to make her see. He would implore the presence to come to her, to break down her prejudice, to let her have the vision also. So he sat and comforted her, yet longed to get away and think it out. This sense of depression and bitter disappointment hung about him like a burden now, of all times, when he should be happy, if ever he was to be. But Gila was nestling close, patting his sleeve, talking little sweet nonsensical words, as if she had really been the little child she seemed. He looked down at her and smiled. How small she was, and childlike! He must remember that she was very young, and probably had never had much bringing up. Serious things frightened her. He must go gently and lead her. It made him feel old and responsible to look at her, tender, beautiful girl, enveloped as she was in the garment of his ideal of womanhood. Yet there was something about it all that drove him from her. He must think it out, and come to some clear understanding with himself. As it was, it seemed to him as if he were trying to take peace within himself, while before him lay a lot of his own broken vows. He had vowed to himself to bring her to the Christ, and he had not accomplished it. Instead, she had declared she hated him and the presence both. Yet here he sat, making love to her, and ignoring it all. He felt a distinct weakness in himself, but did not know how to remedy it. When he finally got away from Gila and walked feverishly toward the university, he felt as if his soul was crying out within him for a solution of the perplexities in which he was involved. By his side walked a friend, but there seemed to be a veil between them. Ever mingling with his thoughts came the sweet, tear-wet face of Gila, with its Solveig look, pleading up at him from the mist of the evening, luring him, as it were, to forget the Christ. He passed his hand wearily over his eyes, told himself that he had been through a good deal that evening, and his nerves were not as strong as they used to be since the fire. He was surprised to find that it was still early when he got back to his room. Barely 9:30, Yet it had seemed as if it must be near midnight, so much had happened. What he would have thought if he could have known that at that very minute Tennelly was seated in the chair in the library that he had so lately vacated, and Gila, posing bewitchingly in the firelight, merrily talking him over, is hard to say. Not that they were saying anything against him, of course not. Tennelly would never have stood for that, and Gila knew better. But Gila had no intention of giving Tennelly any idea how far matters had gone between herself and Courtland. As for Tennelly, he would have been the most amazed of the three if he could have known all. He had been Courtland's intimate friend for so many years years count like ages when one is in college that he thought he knew him perfectly. He would have sworn to it that Courtland's friendship with Gila had not progressed further than a mere first stage of friendship. He admitted that Gila had an influence over his friend, but that it had really gone heart deep seemed impossible. Courtland was a man of too much force, even young as he was, and too much maturity of thought to be permanently entangled with a girl like Gila. That was what Tennelly thought before Gila had turned her eyes toward him and flung a few of her silver gossamer threads about his soul. For always in those first days of his visits to Gila it had been in Courtland's behalf, first to see if she was good enough for a friend of his friend, and next to get her partnership in the scheme of turning Courtland's thoughts away from morbid things. But that night, for the first time, Tennelly saw the Solveig in Gila, and was stirred on his own account. The childish blue frock and the simple frilled kerchief did their work with his high soul as well, and he sat charmed and watched her. After all, there was more to her than he had thought, or else she was a consummate actress. So Tennelly sat late before the fire, till Gila knew that he would turn aside again often to see her for himself, and then she let him go. End of chapter 24. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. Chapter 25 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gila took herself off to a house party the very next day, with only a tinted, perfumed note, like a flutter of painted wings, to explain that the butterfly had melted into the pleasant sunshine to taste honey in other flowers for a time. In a way, her going was a relief to Courtland. He didn't understand himself. There was something wrong, and he wanted to find out what before he saw her again. It was while he was in this troubled state that he stumbled upon the Bible as something that might possibly bring light. He had studied it before in his biblical literature classes, and found it much like other books, a literary classic, a wonderful gem of beauty in its way, a rare collection of legends, proverbs, allegories, and the like. But looking at it now, with the possible hypothesis that it was the Word of God, all was changed. He remembered once seeing a tray of gems in an exhibit, and among them one that looked like a common pebble. The man who had charge of the exhibit took the little pebble and held it in the palm of his hand for a moment, when it suddenly began to glow and sparkle with all the colors of the rainbow and rival all the other gems. The man explained that only the warmth of the human hand could cause this marvelous change. You might lay the stone under the direct rays of a summer sun, yet it would have no effect until you took it in your hand, when it would give forth its beauty once more. It was like this when he began to read the Bible with the idea that it was the Word of God. Things flashed out at him that fairly dazzled his thoughts, living, palpitating things, as if they were hidden of a purpose to be discovered only by him who cared to search. Hidden truths came to light that filled his soul with wonder. Gradually he understood that belief was the touchstone by which all these treasures were to be revealed. Everywhere he found it. That belief in Christ was a condition to all the blessings promised. He read of hearts hardened and eyes blinded because of unbelief, and came to see that unbelief was something a man was responsible for, not a condition which settled down upon him, and he could not help. Belief was a deliberate act of the will. It was not a theory, nor an intellectual affirmation. It was a position taken, which necessarily must pass into action of some kind. He began to see that without this deliberate belief it was impossible for man to know the things which are purely spiritual. It was the condition necessary for revelation. He was fascinated with the pursuit of this new study. Whitmore came to his room one evening, his face grayer, more strained and horse-like than ever. Whitmore's mother had made another partial recovery, and insisted on his return to college. He was plodding patiently, breathlessly, along in his classes, trying to catch up again. He had paid Courtland back part of the money he borrowed, and was gradually paying the rest in small installments. Courtland hated to take it, but saw that it would hurt him to refuse it. So he had fallen into a habit of stopping now and then to talk about his settlement work, just to show a little friendly interest in him. Whitmore had responded with a quiet wistfulness, and a patient hovering in the background that touched the other man's heart deeply. "I've just come from my rounds," said Whitmore, sitting down apologetically on the edge of a chair. "That old lady you carried the medicine to, she's been telling me how you made tea and toast." He paused and looked embarrassed. "Yes," smiled Courtland. "How's she getting on? Any better?" "No," said Whitmore, the hopeless gray look settling about his sensitive mouth. "She'll never be any better. She's dying." "Well," said Courtland, "that'll be a pleasant change for her, I guess." Whitmore winced. Death had no pleasant associations for him. "She told me you prayed for her. She wants you to do it again." It was plain he thought the praying had been a sort of joke with Courtland. Courtland looked up, the color rising slowly in his face. He saw the accusation in Whitmore's sad eyes. "Of course I know what you think of such things. I've heard you in the class. I don't believe in them any more myself either now." Whitmore's voice had a trail of hopelessness in it. "But somehow I couldn't quite bring myself to make a mockery of prayer, even to please that old woman. You see, my mother still believes in prayer." He spoke apologetically, as of a dear one who had lacked advantages. "But I do believe in prayer," said Courtland earnestly. "What you heard me say in class was before I understood." "Before you understood?" Whitmore looked puzzled. "Listen, Whitmore. Things are all different now. I've met Jesus Christ, and I've got my eyes open. I was blind before, but since I've felt the Presence, everything has been different." And then he told the story of his experience. He did not make a long story of it. He gave brief facts, and when it was finished, Whitmore dropped his face into his hands and groaned. "I'd give anything if I could believe all that again," came from between his long, bony fingers. "It's breaking my mother's heart to have me leave the faith." The slick, hay-like hair fell in wisps over his hands. His high, bony shoulders were hunched despairingly over Courtland's study table. He was a great, pitiful object. "Why don't you, then?" said Courtland, getting up and going to the closet for his overcoat. "It's up to you, you know. You can. God can't do it for you. And of course there's nothing doing till you've taken that step. I found that out." "But how do you reconcile things, calamities, disasters, war, suffering, that poor old woman lying on her attic bed alone? How do you reconcile that with the goodness of God?" "I don't reconcile it. It isn't my business. I leave that to God. If I understood all the whys and wherefores of how this universe is run, I'd be great enough to be a god myself." "But if God is omniscient, I can't see how he can let some things go on. He must be limited in power, or he'd never let some things happen if he's a good God." Whitmore's voice had a plaintive sound. "Well, how do you know that? In the first place, how can you be sure what is a calamity? And say, did it ever strike you that some of the things we blame on God are really up to us? He's handed over his power for us to do things, and we haven't seen it that way. So the things go undone, and God is charged with the consequences." "I wish I could believe that," said Whitmore. "You can. When you really want to enough, you will. Come on, let's get that prayer down to the old lady. I'm sort of an amateur yet, but I'll do my best." They went out into the mist and murk of a spring thaw. Whitmore never forgot that night's experience, the prayer, and the walk home again through the fog. The old woman died at dawning. Courtland spent much time thinking about Gila these days. His whole soul was wrapped up in the desire that she might understand. He was longing for her, idealizing her, thinking of her in her innocent beauty, her charming ways, wondering how she would meet him the next time, what he should say to her, living upon her brief, alluring notes that came to him from time to time like fitful rose petals blown from a garden where he longed to be. But yet in a way it was a relief to have her gone until he could settle the great perplexity that was in his mind concerning her. Gila prolonged her absence by a trip south with her father, and so it was several weeks before Courtland saw her again. There seemed to be a settled sadness over his soul when he prayed about her, and when at last she returned and summoned him to her, he was no nearer a solution of his difficulty than when he had last left her. The hour before he went to her he spent in Stephen's room, turning over the leaves of Stephen's Bible. When he rose at last to go, he turned again to this verse, which had caught his eye among the marked verses that were always so interesting to him because they seemed to have been landmarks in Stephen's life. My presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. It almost startled him, so well did it seem to suit his need. He read on a few verses. And he said unto him, If thy presence go not with me, carry us not up hence. For wherein shall it be known that I and my people have found grace in thy sight? Is it not in that thou goest with us? So shall we be separated, I and my people, from all the people that are upon the face of the earth. Wonderful words those, implying a close relationship that shut out to a certain extent all others who were not one with that presence. He wished he knew what it meant, and in that moment was born within him a desire to understand the Bible and know how believing scholars explained everything. But as he went from the room and on his way, he felt that to some extent he had a solution of his trouble. He was to be under the personal conduct of the presence of God wherever he went, whatever he did. This was to make life less complex, and in some mysterious way the power of the Christ with him was to be made manifest to others. Surely he might trust this in the case of Gila, and feel sure that he would be guided aright, and that she would come to see for herself how there was with him always this guiding power. Surely she would come to know it and love it also. Gila met him with fluttering delight, poutingly reproaching him for not writing oftener, calling him to order for looking solemn, adoringly pretty herself in a little frilly pink frock that gave her the look of a pale anemone, wind-blown, sweet and wild. She talked a good deal about the dandy times she had had and the perfectly peachy men and girls she had met, flattered him by saying she had seen none handsomer or more distinguished than he was. She accepted as a matter of course the lover-like attitude he adopted, let him tell her of his love as long as he was not too solemn about it, teased and played with him, charmed him with every art she knew, dancing from one mood to another like a sprite, winding her gossamer chains about him more and more, until, when he went from her again, he was fairly intoxicated with her beauty. He had lulled his anxiety with the thought that he must wait and be patient until Gila saw. But more and more was it growing hard to approach her about the things that were of most moment to him. Sometimes, when he was wearily trying to find a way back from the froth of her conversation to the real things he hoped she would enjoy with him some day, she would call him an old crab and summon to her side other willing youths to stimulate his jealousy, youths of sometimes unsavory reputation whose presence gave him deep anxiety for her. Then he would tell himself he must be more patient, that she was young and must learn to understand little by little. Gila developed a great interest in Courtland's future, his plans for a career, of which she chattered to him much and often, suggesting ways in which her father might perhaps help him into a position of prominence and power in the political world. But Courtland, with a shadow of trouble in his eyes, always put her off. He admitted that he had thought of politics, but was not ready yet to say what he would do. So spring came on, with its final examinations, and commencement drawing nearer every day. Through it all Courtland found much time to be with Gila, often in company or flashing through a crowded thoroughfare by her side, following her fancy, excusing her follies, laying her mistakes and indiscretions to her youth and innocence, always trying to lead up to his great desire, that she might see his Christ. Tennelly watched the whole performance anxiously. He wanted Courtland to be drawn out of what he considered his morbid state, but not at the price of his peace of mind. He was very sure that Courtland ought not to marry Gila. He was equally sure that she meant nothing serious in her present relation to Courtland. He felt himself responsible in a way, because he had agreed in the plot with his uncle to start her on this campaign. But if Courtland should come out of it with a broken heart, what then? It was just a week before commencement that the crisis came. Gila had summoned Courtland to her. Gila, in her most imperial mood, wearing a bewildering imported frock, whose simple intricacies and daring contrasts were well calculated to upbear a determined spirit in a supreme combat, awaited his coming impatiently. She knew that he had that day received another offer from Ramsay Thomas, tempting in the extreme, and baited with alluring possibilities that certainly were dazzling to her if they were not to her lover. She meant to make him tell her of the offer, and she meant to make him accept it that very afternoon, and clinch the contract by telephoning the acceptance to the telegraph office before he left her home. Courtland was tired. He had been through a hard week of examinations. He had been on several committees, and had a number of important class meetings and the like. There had been functions galore to attend, and late hours that were unavoidable. He had come to her hoping for a rest and the joy of her society. Just to watch her dainty grace as she moved about a room, handling the tea things and giving him a delicate sandwich or a crisp cake, filled him with joy and soothed his troubled spirit. It was so like his ideal of what a woman should be. But Gila was not handing out tea that afternoon. She had other fish to fry, and she went at her business with a determination that very soon showed him there was no rest to be had there. Very prettily, but quite efficiently, she bored him for information about his plans. Had he no plans whatever about what he was going to do as soon as he had finished college? Of course she knew he had money of his own. He had never told her how much, and there hadn't really been any way of asking a man like Courtland when he didn't choose to tell a thing like that. But nowadays that was nothing. Even rich men all did something. One wasn't anything unless one was in something big. Hadn't he ever had any offers at all? It was queer, such a brilliant man as he was. She knew lots of young fellows who had no end of chances to get into big things as soon as they were done with their education. Didn't his father know of something, or have something in mind for him? Hadn't he ever been approached? Goaded at last by her delicate but determined insinuations, Courtland told her. Yes, he had had offers, one in particular that was a fine thing from a worldly point of view, but he didn't intend to take it. It did not fit with his ideal of life. There were things about it that were not square. He wasn't quite sure how his own plans were going to work out yet. He must have a talk with his father first. Possibly he would study a while longer somewhere. Gila frowned. She had no idea of letting him do that. She wanted him to get into something big right away, so that she might begin her career. So that was what had been standing in his way. Study! How stupid! No, indeed. She wanted no scholar for a husband who would bore her with horrid old dull books and lectures and never want to go anywhere with her. She must switch him away from this idea at once. She returned to the rejected business proposal with zeal and avidity. What was it? What did it involve? What were its future possibilities? Great! What on earth could he find in that to object to? How ridiculous! How long ago had that been offered to him? Was it too late to accept? What? He had had the offer repeated even more flatteringly that very day. Where was the letter? Would he let her see it? She bent over Uncle Ramsay's brusque sentences with a hidden smile of triumph, and pretended to be surprised. How perfectly wonderful! All that responsibility and all those chances to get to the top, even a hint of Washington! She dimpled and opened her great eyes, imploring at him. She pictured herself in glowing terms going with him and holding court among the great of the land. She wheedled and coaxed and all but commanded, while he sat and watched her sadly, realizing how well fitted she was for the things she was describing, and how she loved them all. So shall we be separated, I and my people, from all the people that are upon the face of the earth. He sat upright. It was as if a voice had spoken the words, those strange words from the Bible. Was this then what they meant? Separation? But Gila was his people now. Was she not one day to be his wife? He must explain it all to her. He must let her know that he had chosen a way of separation that forbade the paths wherein she was longing to wander. Would she shrink and wish to turn back? Nevertheless, he must make it plain to her. Gently, quietly, he tried to make her understand. He told her of the visit of Ramsay Thomas and his own decision in the winter. He told her of the factory that was built to blind the eyes of those who were trying to uplift and help men. He tried to make conditions plain where girls as young as she, and with just such hopes and fears and ambitions, perhaps in some cases just as much sweetness and native beauty as she had, were obliged to spend long hours of toil amid surroundings that must crush the life out of any pure soul, and turn all the sweetness to bitterness, the beauty to a peril. He hinted at things she did not know nor dream of, dreadful things from which her life had always been safely guarded, and how he could not, for the sake of those crushed souls, accept a position that would close its mouth and tie his hands forever from doing anything about it. He told her he could not accept honor that was founded upon dishonor, that he had taken Christ for his pattern and guide, that he could do nothing that would drive God's presence from him. She had been sitting with her face averted, her clasped hands dropped straight down at the side of her lap, the fingers interlaced and tense in excitement, her bosom heaving with agitation under the Paris gown. But when he reached this point in his argument, she sprang to her feet and away from him, standing with her shoulders drawn back, her head thrown up, her chin out, her whole lithe body stiff and imperious. "It is time this stopped," she said, and her voice was cold like a frozen dagger and went straight through his heart. "It is time you put away forever this ridiculous idea of a presence, and of setting yourself up to be better than any one else. This isn't religion, it is fanaticism, and it has got to stop now and forever, or I will have nothing whatever to do with you. Either you give up this idea of a ghost following you around all the time, and accept Mr. Ramsay Thomas's offer this afternoon, or you and I part. You must choose now between me and your presence." End of chapter 25. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. Chapter 26 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gila had never been more beautiful than when she stood and uttered her terrible ultimatum to Courtland. Her little imperial head sat on her lovely shoulders royally. Her attitude was perfect grace. Her spirited face, with its dark eyes and lashes, its setting of blue-black hair, was fascinating in its exquisite modeling. She looked like a proud young cameo standing for her portrait. But her words shot through Courtland's heart like icy swords dividing his soul from his body. He rose to his feet, gone suddenly white and stern, and stood looking at her as if his own heart had turned traitor and slain him. A moment they stood in battle array, two forces representing the two great powers of the universe. Looking straight into each other's souls they stood, plumbing the depths, seeing as in a revelation what each really was. To Courtland it was suddenly made plain that this girl had no part or lot in the things that had become vital to him. She had not seen, she would not see. Her love was not great enough to carry her over the bridge that separated them and back over which he might not go after her. Gila, in her fierce haughtiness, looked into her lover's eyes and saw, as she had never seen before, the mighty strength of his character. Saw that here was a man such as she would not likely meet again upon her way, and she was about to lose him forever. Saw that he would never give in about a matter of principle, and that his love was worth all the more to any woman because he would not. Knew which way he would choose from the first word of her challenge, yet the little fury within her would not let her withdraw. She stood with haughty mien and cold flashing eyes, watching him suffer the blow she had dealt him. Knew that it was more than his love for her she was killing with that blow, yet she did not withdraw it while she might. Gila, do you mean that? She looked him straight in the eye and thrust her sword in the deeper with a steady hand. I do. He stood for a moment looking sternly at her with that cold, observant glance, as if he would have this last picture of her this way to cut away all tender memories that might cause pain in the future. Then he turned as if to one who stood by his side. Not looking back again, he said clearly and distinctly, I choose. And with erect bearing he passed out of the door. Gila stood, white and furious, her little clenched fists down at her side, the sharp little teeth biting into the red underlip until the blood came. She heard the front door shut in the distance, and her soul cried out within her, yet she stood still and held her ground. She turned her face toward the library window. Between the curtains she could presently see his tall form walking down the street. He was not drooping nor disheartened. He held his head up and walked as if in company with one whom he was proud to own. There was nothing dejected about the determined young back. Fine, noble, handsome as a man could be. She saw that one glimpse of his figure for a moment. Then he passed beyond her sight, and she knew in her heart he would come to her no more. She had sent him from her forever. She dashed up to her room in a fury and locked herself in. She wept and stormed and denied herself to every one. She watched and waited for the telephone to ring, yet she knew he would not call her up. Courtland never knew where he was walking as he went forth that day to meet his sorrow and face it like a man. He passed some of his professors, but did not see them. Pat McCluny came up, and he looked him in the eye with an unseeing stare and walked on. Pat stood still and looked after him, puzzled. Holy Mackinaw! What's eating the poor stew now? He ejaculated. He stood for a moment looking back after Courtland as he walked straight ahead, passing several more university fellows without so much as a nod of recognition. Then he turned and slowly followed on through the city streets, out into the quieter suburbs, out farther into the real country, mile after mile, out a bypath where grass grew thick and wild flowers straggled underfoot, where presently a stream wound soft and deep between steep banks, and rocks loomed high on either hand. Under a railroad bridge and up among the rocks, climbing and puffing till at last they stood upon a great rock, McCluny just a little way behind and out of sight. It was there in a sort of crevice, where the natural fall of the crumbling rocks had formed a shelter, that Courtland dropped upon his knees, not as a spot he had been seeking for, but as a haven to which he had been led. He knelt, and all that Pat, standing, awed and uncovered, a few feet below, heard was, "Oh God! Oh God!" He knelt there a long time while Pat waited below, trying to think what to do. The sun was beginning to sink, and a soft pink summer light was glinting over the brown rocks and bits of moss and grasses. The young leaves waved lightly overhead like children dancing in the morning, and something of the sweetness and beauty of the scene crept into Pat McCluny's soul as he stood and waited before this Gethsemane gate for a man he loved to come forth. At last he stepped up the rocks quietly and came and stood by Courtland, laying a gentle hand upon his shoulder. "Come on, old man. It's getting late. About time we were going back." Courtland got up and looked at him in a dazed way, as if his soul had been bruised and he was only just recovering consciousness. Without a word he turned and followed Pat back again to the city. They did not talk on the way back. Pat whistled a little, that was all. When they reached the gates of the university, Courtland turned and put out his hand, speaking in his own natural tone. "Thanks awfully, old chap. Sorry to have made you all this trouble." "That's all right, pard," said Pat huskily, grasping the hand in his big fist. "I saw you were up against it, and I stuck around. That's all." "I shan't forget it." They parted to their rooms. It was long past supper time. Pat went away by himself to think. Over and over again to himself Courtland was saying, as he came to himself and began to realize what had come to him, "It isn't so much that I have lost her. It is that she should have done it." Pat said nothing even to Tennelly about his walk with Courtland. He figured that Courtland would rather they did not know. He simply hovered near like a faithful dog, ready for whatever might turn up. He was relieved to see that his friend came down to breakfast next morning with a white, resolute face, and went about the order of the day quietly, as if everything were as usual. Tennelly and Bill Ward were on the alert. They had missed Courtland from the festivities the night before, but were so thoroughly occupied with their own part in the busy week that they had little time to question him. Later in the day Tennelly began to wonder why Courtland had not brought Gila as he intended for the class play, but a note from Gila informed him that she was done with Paul Courtland forever, and that he would have to get someone else to further his uncle's schemes, for she would not. She intimated that she might explain further if he chose to call, and Tennelly made a point of calling in between things, and found Gila inscrutable. All he could gather was that she was very, very angry with Courtland, hopelessly so, and that she considered him worth no more effort on her part. She was languidly interested in Tennelly, and accepted his invitation to the dance that evening most graciously. She had expected to go in Courtland's company, but now if he repented and came to claim his right, she would ignore it. But Courtland had taken Gila at her word. He had no idea of claiming any further engagement with her. She had cut him off forever, and he must abide by it. Courtland had spent the night upon his knees in the little sacred room at the end of the hall. He was much stronger to face things than he had been when he left her. So when he met Gila walking with Tennelly, he lifted his hat courteously and passed on, his face grave and stern as when she had seen him last, but in no way showing other sign that he had suffered or repented his choice. Pat, walking by his side, looked furtively at Gila, then keenly at his companion, and winked to his inner consciousness. "She's the poor simp that did the business, and she looks her part, believe me," he told himself. "But he'll get over that. He's too big to miss her long." Although there was pain in these days that followed Courtland's choice, there was also great peace in his heart. He seemed to have grown older, counting days as years, and to have a wider vision on life. Love of woman was gone out of his life, he thought, forever. Love wasn't an illusion, quite as he had thought. No, but Gila had not loved him, or she never would have made him choose as she did. That was plain. If she had not loved, then it was better he should go out of her life. He was glad that the university days were over, and he might begin a new environment somewhere. He felt something strong with his soul pushing him on to a decision. Was it the voice calling him again, leading up to what he was to do? This thought was uppermost in his mind during the commencement, which beforehand had meant so much to him. With all the 4 years had been the goal to which he had been urging forward. Now that it was here he seemed to have gone beyond it somehow, and found it to be but a little detail by the way, a very small matter not worth stopping and making so much fuss about. Of course, if Gila had loved him, if she had been going to be there watching for him when he came forward to take his diploma, if she were to be listening when he delivered that oration upon which he had spent so much time and for which he received so much commendation, that would have meant everything to him a few brief days ago, of course. Then it would have been different. But as it was, he wondered that everybody seemed so much interested in things and took so much trouble for a lot of nonsense. Courtland was surprised to see his father come into the great hall just as he went up on the platform with his class. He hadn't expected his father. He was a busy man who did not get away from his office often. It touched him that his father cared to come. He changed his plans and made it possible to take the train home with him after the exercises, instead of waiting a day or two to pack up, as he had expected to do. The packing could wait a while, so he went home with his father. They had a long talk on the way, one of the most intimate that they had ever had. It appeared during the course of conversation that Mr. Courtland had heard of the offer made to his son by Ramsay Thomas, and that he was not unfavorable to its acceptance. "Of course, you don't really need to do anything of the sort, you know, Paul," he said affably. "You've got what your mother left you now, and on your 25th birthday there will be $250,000 coming to you from your grandfather Courtland's estate. You could spend your life in travel and study if you cared to, but I fancy, with your temperament, you wouldn't be quite satisfied with an idle life like that. What's your objection to this job?" Courtland told the whole story carefully, omitting no detail of the matter concerning conditions at the factory, and the matters at which he was not only expected to wink, but also sometimes to help along by his influence. He realized, as he told it, that his father would look at the thing fairly, but very differently. "Well, after all," said the father, comfortably settling himself to another cigar, "that's all a matter of sentiment. It doesn't do to be too squeamish, you know, if you have ambitions. Besides, with your income, you would have been able to help out and do a lot of good. You ought to have thought of that." "In other words, earn my salary by squeezing the life out of them and then toss them a penny to buy medicine. I don't see it that way. No, Dad, if I can't work at something clean, I'll go out and work in the ground, or do nothing, but I won't oppress the poor." "Oh, well, Paul, that's all right if you feel that way about it, of course. Ramsay Thomas wanted me to talk it over with you, promised to do the square thing by you and all that, and he's a pretty good man to get in with. Of course, I won't urge you against your will. But what are you going to do, son? Haven't you thought of anything?" "Yes," said Courtland, leaning back and looking steadily at his father. "I've decided that I'd like to study theology." "Theology!" The father started and knocked an ash delicately from the end of his cigar. Well, that's not a bad idea. Rather odd, perhaps, but still there's always dignity and distinction in it. Your great-grandfather on your mother's side was a clergyman in the Church of England. Of course, it's rather a surprise, but it's always respectable, and with your money you would be independent. You wouldn't have any trouble in getting a wealthy and influential church, either. I could manage that, I think." "I'm not sure that I want to be a clergyman, Father. I said study theology. I want to know what scholarly Christians think of the Bible. I've studied it with a lot of scholarly heathen who couldn't see anything in it but literary merit. Now I want to see what it is that has made it a living power all through the ages. I've got to know what saints and martyrs have founded their faith upon." "Well, Paul, I'm afraid you're speaking of an idealist and a dreamer like your mother. Of course, it's all right with your income, but, generally speaking, it's as well to have an object in view when you take up study. If I were you, I would look into the matter most carefully before I made any decisions. If you really think the ministry is what you want, why, I'll just put a word in at our church for you. Our old Dr. Bates is getting a little out of date, and he'll be about ready to be put on the retired list by the time you are done with your theological course. Let's see, how long is it? 3 years? Has you thought where you'll go? What seminary? Better make a careful selection. It has so much to do with getting a good church afterward." "Father, you don't understand," said Courtland desperately, and then sat back and wondered how he should begin. His father had been a prominent member of the board of trustees in his own church for years, but had he ever felt the presence? In the days when Courtland used to sit and kick his heels in the old family pew and be reproved for it by his aunt, he never remembered any presence. Dr. Bates's admirable sermons had droned on over his head like the dreamy humming of bees in a summer day. He couldn't remember a single thought that ever entered his mind from that source. Was that all that came of studying theology? Well, he would find out, and if it was, he would quit it. They were all comfortably glad to see him at home. His stepmother beamed graciously upon him in between her social engagements, and his young brothers swarmed over him, demanding all the athletic news. The house was big, ornate, perfect in its way. It was good to eat such superior cooking, that is, if he had been caring to eat anything just then, and there was a certain freedom in life out of college that he knew he ought to enjoy. But somehow he was restless. The girls he used to know reminded him of Gila, or else had grown old and fat. The country club didn't interest him in the least, nor did the family's plans for the summer. It suited him not at all to be lionized on account of his brilliant career at college. It bored him to go into society. Sometimes when he was alone in his room, he would think of the situation and try to puzzle it out. It seemed as if he and the Presence were there on a visit which neither of them enjoyed very much, and which they were enduring for the sake of his father, who seemed gratified to have his eldest son at home once more. But all the time Courtland was chafing at the delay. He felt there was something he ought to be about. There wasn't anything here. Not even the young brothers presented a very hopeful field, or perhaps he didn't know how to go about it. He tried telling them stories one day when he wheedled them off in the car with him, and they listened eagerly when he told them of the fire in the theater, Stephen Marshall's wonderful part in the rescue of many, and his death. But when he went on and tried to tell them in boy language of his own experience, He could see them look strangely, critically at him, and finally the oldest one said, "Aw, rats! What kind of rot are you giving us, Paul? You were nutty then, of course." And he saw that, young as they were, their eyes were holden like the rest. In the second week Courtland made his decision. He would go back to the university and pack up. Gila would be away from the city by that time. There would be no chance of meeting her and having his wound opened afresh. The fellows would be all gone, and he could do about as he pleased. It was the second day after he went back that he met Pat on the street, and it was from Pat that he learned that Tennelly and Bill Ward had gone down to the shore to a house party given by that fluffy ruffles cousin of Bill's. Pat drew his own conclusions from the white look on Courtland's face when he told him. He would heartily have enjoyed throttling the girl if he had had a chance just then, when he saw the look of suffering in Courtland's eyes. Pat clung to Courtland all that week, helped him pack, and dogged his steps, except when he visited the little sacred room at the end of the hall in the dormitory. Courtland was never sure of freedom from him. He was always on hand to propose a hike or a trip to the movies when he saw Courtland was tired. Courtland was grateful, and there was something so loyal about him that he couldn't give him the slip. So when he went down after Burns and whirled him away in his big gray car to the seashore Friday morning to stay until Saturday evening, Pat went along. End of chapter 26. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana. Chapter 27 of The Witness by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. They certainly were a queer trio, the little Scotch preacher, the big Irish athlete, and the cultured aristocrat. Yet they managed to have a mighty good time of it those 2 days at the shore, and came back the warmest of friends. Pat proved his devotion to Burns by attending church the next day with Courtland, and listening attentively to every word that was said. It is true, he did it much in the same way the fellows used to share one another's stunts in college, sticking by and helping out when one of the gang had a hard task to perform. But it pleased both Courtland and Burns that he came. Courtland wondered, as he shared the hymn book with him and heard him growl out a few bass notes to old Rock of Ages, why it was that it seemed to fill him with a kind of exultation to hear Pat sing. He hadn't yet recognized the call to go a-fishing for men, nor knew that it was the divine angler's deep delight in his employment that was filling him. It was while they were singing that hymn that he stole a look at Pat and felt a sudden wonder whether he would understand about the presents or not, a burning desire to tell him about it some time if the right opportunity offered. The days down at the shore had done a lot for Courtland. He had taken care that the spot he selected was many miles removed from the popular resort where Mr. Dare had a magnificent cottage, and there had been absolutely nothing in the whole 2 days to remind him of Gila. It was a quiet place with a far, smooth beach, and no boardwalks nor crowds to shut out the vision of the sea. He leaped along the sand and dived into the water with his old enthusiasm. He played like a fish in the ocean. He taught Burns several things about swimming, and played pranks like a schoolboy. He basked in the sun and told jokes, laughing at Pat's brilliant wit and Burns' dry humor. At night they took long walks upon the sand and talked of deep things that Pat could scarcely understand. He was satisfied to stride between them, listening to the vigorous ring of Courtland's old natural voice again. He heard their converse high above where he lived, and loved them for the way they searched into things too deep for him. It was out in the wildest, loneliest part of the beach that night that he heard the first hint of what had come to the soul of Courtland. Pat had come of Catholic ancestry. He had an inheritance of reverence for the unseen. He had never been troubled with doubts or sneers. He had let religion go by and shed it like a shower, but he respected it. Courtland spent much time in the vicinity of the factory and of Robert Burns's church during the next few weeks. He helped Burns a good deal, for the man had heavily taxed himself with the burdens of the poor about him. Courtland found ways to privately relieve necessity and put a poor soul now and then on his feet and able to face the world again by the loan of a few cents or dollars. It took so pitifully little to open the gate of heaven to some lives. Courtland, with his keen intellect and fine perceptions, was able sometimes to help the older man in his perplexities. And once, when Burns was greatly worried over a bill that was hanging fire during a prolonged session of Congress, Courtland went down to Washington for a weekend and hunted up some of his father's congressional friends. He told them a few facts concerning factories in general, and a certain model white marble, much bevined factory in particular, that at least opened their eyes if it did not make much difference in the general outcome. But though the bill failed to pass that session, being skillfully sidetracked, Courtland had managed to stir up a bit of trouble for Uncle Ramsay Thomas that made him storm about his office wrathfully and wonder who that darned little rat of a preacher had helping him now. It was late in September that Pat, with a manner of studied indifference, told Courtland of a rumor that Tennelly was engaged to Gila Dare. It was the very next Sunday night that Tennelly turned up at Courtland's apartment after he and Pat had gone to the evening service, and followed them to the church. He dropped into a seat beside Pat, amazed to find him there. "You here?" he whispered, grasping Pat's hand with the old friendly grip. "Where's Court?" Pat grinned and nodded up toward the pulpit. Tennelly looked forward and for a minute did not comprehend. Then he saw Courtland sitting gravely in a pulpit chair by the little red-headed Scotch preacher. "What in thunder!" he growled almost out loud. "What's the joke?" Pat's face was on the defensive at once, though it was plain he was enjoying Tennelly's perplexity. "Court's going to speak to-night." It was probable Pat never enjoyed giving any information so much as that sentence in his life. "The deuce he is!" said Tennelly out loud. "You're lying, man!" Which, considering that the Scotchman was praying, was slightly out of place. Pat frowned. "Shut up, Nellie! Can't you see the game's called? I'm telling you straight. If you don't believe it, wait and see." Tennelly looked again. That surely was Courtland sitting there. What could be the meaning of it all? Had Courtland taken to itinerary preaching? Consternation filled his soul. He loved Courtland as his own brother. He would have done anything to save his brilliant career for him. He hadn't intended staying to service. His plan had been to slip in, get Courtland to come away with him, have a talk, and go back to the shore on the late train. But the present situation altered his plans. There was nothing for it now but to stay and see this thing through. Pat was a whole lot deeper than the rest had ever given him credit for being. Pat was enjoying the psychological effect of the service on Tennelly. He had never been much of a student in the psychology class, but when it came right down to plain looking into another man's soul and telling what he was thinking about and what he was going to do next, Pat was all there. That was what made him such an excellent football player. When he met his opponent, he could always size him up and tell just what kind of plays he was going to make, and know how to prepare for them. Pat was no fool. That was a most unusual service. The minister read the story of the martyr Stephen and the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, taken from the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th chapters of Acts. It was brief and dramatic in the reading. Even Tennelly was caught and held as Burns read in his clear, direct way that made Scripture seem to live again in modern times. "I have asked my friend, Mr. Courtland, to tell you the story of how he met Jesus one day on the Damascus road," said Burns, as he closed the Bible and turned to Courtland, sitting still with bowed head just behind him. Courtland had made many speeches during his college days. He had been the prince among his class for debate. He had been proud of his ability as a speaker, and had delighted in being able to hold and sway an audience. He had never known stage fright, nor dreaded appearing before people. But ever since Burn had asked him if he would be willing to tell the story of the presence to his people in the church before he left for his theological studies, Courtland had been just plain frightened. He had consented. Somehow he couldn't do anything else. It was so obviously, to his mind, a call. But if he had been a coward in any sense, he would have run away that Saturday afternoon and got out of it all. Only his horror of being yellow had kept him to his promise. Since ascending to the platform, he had been overcome by the audacity of the idea that he, a mere babe in knowledge, a recent scorner, should attempt to get up and tell a roomful of people who knew far more about the Bible than he did, how he found Christ. There were no words in which to tell anything. They had all fled from his mind, and it was blank. He dropped his head upon his hand in his weakness to pray for strength, and a great calm came to his soul. The prayer and Bible reading had steadied him, and he had been able to get a hold of what he had to say as the story of the young man Saul progressed. But when he heard himself being introduced so simply, and knew his time had come, He seemed to hear the words he had read that afternoon. "Fear not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee. I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness." Courtland lifted up his head and arose. He faced the sea of faces that a few moments before had swum before his gaze as if they had been a million. Then all at once Tennelly's face stood out from all the rest, intent, curious, wondering, and Courtland knew that his opportunity had come to tell Tennelly about the Presence. Tennelly, the man whom he loved above all other men. Tennelly, the man who perhaps loved Gila and was to be close to her through life. His fears vanished. His soul burned within him. Fixing his eyes on that fine, vivid face, Courtland began his story, and truly the words that he used must have been drawn red hot from his heart, for he spoke as one inspired, simply as if he were alone in the room with Tennelly. He looked into his friend's eyes and told his story, forgetting all others present, intent only on making Tennelly see what Christ had been to him, what he was willing to be to Tennelly and Gila, if they would. Tennelly did not take his eyes from the speaker. It was curious to see him so absorbed. Tennelly, who was so conventional, so careful what people thought, so always conscious of all elements in his environment. It was as if his soul were sitting frankly in his eyes for the first time in his life, and things, unsuspected perhaps even by himself, came out and showed themselves, traits, weaknesses, possibilities, longings too, and pride. When Courtland had finished and sat down, he did not drop his head upon his hands again. He had spoken in the strength of the Lord. He had nothing of which to be ashamed. He was looking now at the audience, no longer at Tennelly. He began to realize that it had been given to him to bear the message to all these other people also. He was filled with humble exultation that to him had been entrusted this great opportunity. The people, too, were hushed and filled with awe. They showed by the quiet way they reached for the hymn books, the reverent bowing of their heads for the final prayer, that they had all felt the power of Christ with the speaker. They lingered, many of them, and came up, pressing about him, just to touch his hand and make mute appeal with their troubled eyes. Some to ask him eagerly for reassurance of what he had been saying, others to thank him for the story. They were so humble, so sincere, so eager, these common people, like the ones of old who crowded around the Master and heard him gladly. Paul Courtland was filled with humility. He stood there half embarrassed as they pressed about him. He took their hands and smiled his brotherhood, but scarcely knew what to say to them. He felt an awkward boy who had made a great discovery about which he was too shy to talk. Pat and Tennelly stood back against the wall and waited, saying not a word. Tennelly watched the people curiously as they went out, humble, common people, subdued, wistful, even tearful, some of them with illumined faces, as if they had seen a great light in their darkness. When at last Courtland drifted down to the back of the church and reached Tennelly, the two met with a look straight into each other's soul, while their hands gripped in the old brotherhood clasp. Not a smile nor a commonplace expression crossed either face, just that strong, steady look of recognition and understanding. It was Tennelly looking at Courtland, the new man in Christ Jesus. Courtland looking at Tennelly after he had heard the story. They walked back to Courtland's apartments almost in silence, a kind of holy embarrassment upon them all. Pat whistled Rock of Ages softly under his breath most of the way. They sat for a time, talking, stiffly, as if they hardly knew each other, telling the news. Bill Ward had gone to California to look into a big land deal in which his father was interested. Whitmore's mother had died, and he wasn't coming back next year for his senior year. It was all surface talk. Pat put in a little about football. He discussed which of last year's scrubs were most helpful candidates for the varsity team this year. Not one of the three at that moment cared a rap whether the university had any football team or not. Their thoughts were upon deeper things. But the recent service was not mentioned, nor the extraordinary fact of Courtland's having taken part in it. By common consent they shunned the subject. It was too near the heart of each. Finally Pat discreetly took himself off, professedly in search of ice water, as the cooler in the hall had for some reason run dry. He was gone some time. When he had left the room, Tennelly sat up alert. He had something to say to Courtland alone. It must be said now before Pat returned. Courtland got up, crossed the room, and stood looking out of the window on the myriad lights of the city. There was in his face a far yearning, and something too deep for words. It was as if he were waiting for a blow to fall. Tennelly looked at Courtland's back and gathered up his courage. "Court," he said, hoarsely, trying to summon the nomenclature of the dear old days, "there's something I wanted to ask you. Is there between you and Gila Dare that makes it disloyal for your friend to try and win her if he can?" It was very still in the room. The whir of the trolleys could be heard below, as if they were out in the hall. They grated harshly on the silence. Courtland stood as if carved out of marble. It seemed ages to Tennelly before he answered, with the sadness of the grave in his tone. "No, Nelly, it's all right. Gila and I didn't hit it off. It's all over between us forever. Go ahead. I wish you luck." There was an attempt at the old loving understanding in the answer, but somehow the last words had almost the sound of a sob in them. Tennelly had a feeling that he was wringing his own happiness out of his friend's soul. "Thanks awfully, Court. I didn't know," he said, awkwardly. "I think she likes me a lot, but I couldn't do anything if you had the right of way." When Pat came back with a tray of glasses clinking with ice and the smell of crushed lemons, they were talking of the new English professor and the chances that he would be better than the last, who was punk. But Pat was not deceived. He looked from one to the other and knew the blow had fallen. He might have prevented it, but what was the use? It had to come sooner or later. They talked late. Finally Tennelly rose and came toward Courtland with his hand outstretched, and they all knew that the real moment of the evening had come at last. "That was a great old talk you gave us this evening, Court." Tennelly's voice was husky with feeling. One felt that he had been keeping the feeling out of sight all the evening. He was holding Courtland's hand in a painful grip and looking again into his eyes as if he would search his soul to the depths. "You sure have got hold of something there that's worth looking into. You had a great hold on your audience, too. Why, you almost persuaded me there was something in it." Tennelly tried to finish his sentence in lighter vein, but the feeling was in his voice yet. Courtland gripped his hand and looked his yearning with a sudden light of joy and hope. "If you only would, Nelly! It's been the thing I've longed for." "Not yet," said Tennelly, almost pulling his hand away from the detaining grasp. "Sometime, perhaps, but not now. I've too much else on hand. I must beat it now. Man alive, do you know what time it is? See you soon again." Tennelly was off in a whirl of words. "Almost thou persuadest me." Had some one whispered the words behind him as he went? Courtland stood looking after him till the door closed. Then he turned and stepped to the window again. He was so long standing there motionless that Pat went at last and touched him on the shoulder. "Say, pard," he said in a low, gruff voice, "I'm nothing but a roughneck, I know, and not worth much at that. But if it's any satisfaction to you to know you've bowled a bum like me over to his side, why, I'm with you." Courtland turned and grasped his hand, throwing the other arm about Pat's shoulder. "It sure is, Pat, old boy," he said, eagerly. "It's the greatest thing ever. Thanks! I needed that just now. I'm all in." They stood so for some minutes with their arms across each other's shoulders, looking out of the window to the city, lying sorrowfully, forgetful, sinful, before them, down to the street below where Tennelly hastened on to win his Gila, up to the quiet, wise old stars above. End of chapter 27. Recording by Scarlett, Louisiana.